Buenas tardes a todos.
So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Fundación Telefónica, to this new event of Tech&Society program. I'm here with José Areilza. He's the Secretary General for Aspen Institute. My name is Pablo Gonzalo. I'm in charge of the area of knowledge and digital culture of the foundation. I just wanted to welcome you. As you know, Tech&Society is a program where we luckily can collaborate with the Aspen Institute, and this is fostered by both institutions. We've been working on this program for 8 years, and both institutions are committed in analyzing every change and the impact that technology is having at different levels of our life. Today we have the first public event of this year, and luckily we have Angela Zhang with us. I would like to say thank you for being with us today. She is one of the most important experts on a global scale in terms of regulation in the digital environment, and she will give us a talk that is going to be amazing. And we have Ignacio Torreblanca with us, who will help us moderate and hold the interview, and I would like to say thank you for his participation, and of course thank you to all the attendees, and I hope you can squeeze this new event as much as possible. So that's all for me, but I would like to give the mic to José. Thank you very much, Pablo. I just wanted to add that the seat of this event that we have in collaboration with the European Council of Outer Relationships was an idea by Ángel Torreblanca, who is a friend of Aspen Institute, and we decided that we are speaking about digital technology, geopolitics, etc. We thought that we should have a voice like Professor Zhang. She's one of the most famous voices in the world to understand what's going on in China and how this plays a role in the global arena. And I would like to say thank you to our large audience, and we will keep on debating and asking important questions to understand how this progress and how this digital technology development and disruptive technologies can humanize, and they can be used for the common good. Thank you very much.
So thank you again, dear friends at Aspen, José María, and the foundation. Pablo, you're still around, and especially thanks to you for being here today. You know, we had Anu Bradford in Madrid some time ago, and she told us, you have to get Angela to come to Madrid. And we said, of course, you know, and we're so glad you're here. So what we're going to do is we're going to listen to you for the first maybe 20 minutes. Then, you know, maybe I'll do some follow-up questions on your talk, and then we will open up to everyone to have an open conversation and so on. So thank you again, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a huge honor for me to be on stage today with the audience, and look, I mean, I have traveled to 9 countries to present this book. And it's been 3 months, and today is the last stop of the entire book tour, and it really couldn't be better. And I think this is really the grand finale, and I'm so glad that the book tour ends today and with you guys. So I have all the energy I have to pour into today's talk. I still have a lot of voices. So the book was published in March. It has done pretty well so far. This is my second book. My first book talked about Chinese antitrust, and this book touches upon a much bigger topic on how China regulates the tech sector. Now, this is a very important area of law because the tech sector contributes to almost 40% of China's GDP and employ almost 200 million people in China, right? I mean, so it's a very, very important area of regulation. I will even go as far as to say this is one of the most consequential area of Chinese law, okay? And I will start by giving you a very small example. So on the Christmas Eve of 2020, the China's Administration for Market Regulation, China's antitrust regulator, published this very short one-sentence announcement. It's in Chinese, but I can explain. It's basically saying that it is investigating Alibaba, which is China's biggest e-commerce giant, for conducting a choose one from two exclusive business practice. Okay. Now, 10 minutes later, the People's Daily, which is the party mouthpiece, published a long commentary endorsing the SAMR's investigation. So obviously, this was well orchestrated in advance, right? I mean, they can't possibly prepare a long commentary, within 10 minutes. Guess how the market reacted the next day? The next day, Alibaba's stock tumbled 13%. Wiping out over $100 billion market cap from this company, okay? So 4 months later, Alibaba eventually received a fine of $2.8 billion. This is the highest fine the Chinese antitrust regulator had ever imposed on this firm. I will even say this is probably one of the biggest fines in the history of antitrust enforcement globally. But it's nothing compare with the $100 billion market cap loss it had already incurred during Christmas time, right? The market has severely punished this firm. And in the following months after the investigation, Alibaba went from a firm that used to have over $800 billion market cap at its peak to now a firm worth only $180 billion. In other words, this firm lost over 75% of its market cap during China's tech crackdown. So this is what my book is about. Why does China went about regulating its own big tech giants? This is so counterintuitive, right? When you would think the Chinese government would do everything it can to prop up its Chinese tech sector, right? To nurture its own national champions. Why would the Chinese government do that? And how they went about doing that, right? I mean, why does just a simple announcement of an investigation could already send the firm's stock tumble 13%, right? There's not even a penalty or any serious investigation yet. It's just an announcement. It's already, you send a very strong signal to the market. And what are the consequences of this crackdown, right? Has Chinese market really regained, gained more competition and gained more dynamics, right? Has it injected more competition? Has it changed the competition dynamic? Do we have new entries, right? I mean, these are the questions that the book addresses. And in today's talk, I will not only explain what happened with China's tech crackdown, but most importantly, to introduce this dynamic pyramid model, which is the central theme of the book, to explain how China regulates in general. Because this model is not only helpful for us to think about how China regulates tech, but also all sorts of policy areas you think the Chinese government is currently dealing with at the moment. And because of the, now everybody talks about AI, I have to save some time to use this model, apply it to think about how China will regulate AI, particularly in the event of the generative AI era. How do we think about regulations? The dynamic pyramid model that I introduced in the book is actually inspired by system thinking, which sees our world as a very complex system. Now, particularly in the Chinese context, I see that there's three distinct features in China's regulatory system. First is hierarchy, in a sense that the regulatory structure involves players from different tiers of the Chinese society, right? At the apex, we have the policymakers, the top leadership that's in charge of formulating the strategy for the country. And then we have the regulators who are in charge with day-to-day implementation. And then we have the firms, because you see in China, firms don't tend to resist, like launch a very strong defense against the regulators. Like they're way more obedient. And so the agencies' action tend to be met with very little resistance from firms. And that's why I put them as subordinate to the regulators. And at the bottom are the people, right? I mean, the general public in China, their voices tend to be muted due to censorship and information control. Now, because of this unique hierarchical structure, where power is very centralized, it tends to lead to a lot of volatility in the policy process. Now, one of the most important sources of volatility comes from the fact that agencies' action is very paradoxical, in the sense that they either do very little or they do too much, okay? Why would the agencies do very little? Well, if you're a government official, right, and when you don't receive very clear signal from Beijing about what to do with certain, new technology, then you will try to do very little, because you want to err on the side of caution. You don't want to be deemed as stifling innovation, right? I mean, killing this dynamic sector, right? But when Beijing sends you a very strong signal, look, I mean, this is the direction to go, then you will try to do as much as possible, because this is the point. You want to demonstrate your loyalty to the top. You want to show that you are responding aggressively to the signal from Beijing. And by the way, you want to protect your turf, because everybody else was working very hard to expand the regulatory turf, right? I mean, so it's a point that you have to act. And that's why agency overreach is very common when there is very strong and very clear policy signal. And that leads to the phenomenon they try to do too much, right? So this leads to a lot of volatility in the policy process. And that gives people the impression that Chinese regulation is very erratic, very unpredictable, and very arbitrary. Okay? Now, some of the audience here may be investors in the Chinese tech sector in the past, right? For the perspective of the investors, seeing this kind of huge volatility, huge dramatic regulatory pendulum swing in the tech sector, they will get confused, right? And that tend to amplify the side effects, right? Which I mean the fragility in the regulatory outcome, because investors got confused, right? And they become very risk averse, and they don't want to invest in the Chinese tech sector, right? So that's what I mean by fragility. That very often you see well-intentioned regulatory measures generate vast unintended consequences. And it takes a long time for the policymakers to realize the mistake. And by the time they come back to revert course, then it's already too late and already led to a lot of damage. And that leads to a fragile regulatory outcome. Now, I will use China's tech regulation, this tech crackdown we call, between 2020 and 2022, as a very detailed case study to illustrate this, right? So we have a hierarchy of these four major players in the regulatory system. And in the first stage, you saw Chinese top policymakers were very supportive of the tech sector. Right? Now you heard a lot of the buzzword called the AI Plus initiative. Back then we have the Internet Plus initiative, and it's actually a term coined by Pony Ma of Tencent, China's biggest tech firm, and he was the one who proposed this idea to connect everything together via internet, and particularly why his very powerful WeChat app. And he lobbied the regulators and the top policymakers to seek for very favorable regulatory treatment. So despite the fact that, you start to see a lot of complaints emerging from the platform, and a lot of complaints were reported to the regulators, because the regulators were not accountable to the people, but rather accountable to the top, so they responded to the top's initiative by taking a very lax stance in addressing the matter. Right? It's not like they were not doing anything, it's just that they have so much discretion in dealing with these matters that they can pick and choose what kind of regulatory tools they use to discipline the tech firms. And as a result, the tech firm didn't take things very seriously, Okay, they continue with what they were doing, and during this period, you really witnessed the reckless growth of the Chinese consumer tech businesses. It's kind of like a Wild West where you see the number 1, number 2, number 3 firms merged together. There was no merger control whatsoever, right? And as a result, the information transmission between the regulators to the top leaders was very slow, in a sense that the top policymakers actually didn't know, these firms have grown to be so big, so powerful, so influential, right? They are actually getting out of control. Until this incident. I don't know how many of you have read in newspaper about this famous Chinese entrepreneur called Jack Ma make a controversial speech in a financial summit in Shanghai back in October 2020, and then a few days later, then Ant Group, which is the biggest fintech company that Jack Ma control, and also the biggest globally, the biggest fintech company globally, its IPO was suspended at 11 hours. In the West, when they describe the story, they tend to, portray it as kind of like a war between Jack Ma and President Xi Jinping, because Xi Jinping think that Jack Ma has such a big ego. They didn't like him, but that oversimplified the story. What truly happened in that case was that Ant has grown to be too big, that is posing systematic risk to the Chinese society. Basically, this is a big bubble that the Chinese top leadership and the regulators decided that they have to deflate this bubble. Otherwise, it's going to pose systematic risk to Chinese financial system. Okay, so I have a lot of sympathy for why the regulators need to suspend this IPO, right? Because Ant was estimated to be even bigger than JP Morgan, the largest bank in the world at that time, by pitching itself as a tech firm rather than a financial institution, but in fact offering financial services, right? So here's the dilemma of the Chinese regulator. On the one hand, this is something you need to address because this is a huge bubble in the making. But on the other hand, tackling this problem at the 11th hour also create this impression that this whole thing was driven by political motivation. So in the second stage, you see the Chinese regulators reported this matter to President Xi, so there's no more information asymmetry. And this was a wake-up call for Chinese top leadership who decided that they will mobilize a massive enforcement campaign against all the big tech companies in China. So initially it was targeted at Ant Group and Alibaba. These are the major, these belong to the Jack Ma's business empire. But later, this spread like wildfire, affecting every single tech sector, single company in the tech sector, right? And during this period, President Xi introduced the controversial slogan called "Common Prosperity." Okay, that really alarmed a lot of the international investors, thinking, is China going back to the Mao era, the communism, by emphasizing common prosperity? But if you think about what the government is trying to do here, is to empower all the platform participants, be it the users, the consumers, like the merchants, right, and delivery workers, the delivery drivers, the drivers, right, to empower all these people to better negotiate and bargain with the platform, right? So it does help the government address a lot of the inequality issues in the society. And so, and this also helped President Xi to cultivate a lot of the mass support. However, starting in early 2022, the Chinese economy was in deep trouble after 2 years of lockdown during COVID. And our European audience here will remember vividly in February that year, Russia invaded Ukraine. And that affected Chinese companies because a lot of the international investors holding Chinese stock are very concerned that China might extend help to Russia. And then these Chinese companies might be put on a sanction or non-reliable entity list by the US, right? So there was a massive sell-off of Chinese stocks in March 2022. And that prompted the Chinese, the then Vice Premier Liu He, to convene an emergency meeting, getting together all the major central ministries together and send a very strong signal to the market that it's going to ease regulation. And as soon as that meeting was finished, the next day you see Alibaba and Tencent stock rebounded 20%. Okay, so the market really respond to the policy signal, and ever since then, you see the regulators return to routine and normal enforcement. Right? So in my book, I actually have a slightly more sophisticated diagram that shows that, look, I mean, these three distinct features of China's regulatory system are in fact connected by a very complex network of feedbacks, loops, right? So when you have a very hierarchical regulatory structure, it tends to lead to volatility in the policy process. And the volatility in the policy process and the hierarchy of the structure both tend to amplify side effects with regulation. This is precisely what we have seen with China's consumer tech crackdown, that you see all the major tech firms lost a significant portion of their market capitalization. Firms like Alibaba, like Tencent, lost between 60 to 75% of the market cap, right? So despite the fact that government had hope to inject more competition, trying to bring more innovation to revitalize the sector, it in fact weakened and undermined the most dynamic area of Chinese economy. Okay, but most importantly, when you have very fragile regulatory outcome, it tends to reinforce hierarchy in the sense that because the private investors have retreated, right, and the state institutions start to fill in the void by making aggressive investment in the private sector, enhancing the regulatory control over the tech firms, expanding agency discretion, and empower this bureaucracy, right? So this allowed the state to exercise tighter control in the Chinese tech economy and reinforce the hierarchy. So now we have a very clear feedback loop. It's almost like a vicious cycle. It's a clear vicious cycle, right? When you have a very tight hierarchy, it tends to lead to more volatility, and then it leads to more fragility. Now, how do we apply what we have learned so far to think about the next cycle of China's tech regulation, particularly with AI? Right, we just been through one full cycle of very lax regulation, and then tighten regulation, and then regulatory easing, a full cycle when we deal with consumer tech businesses. What about AI, right? How is Chinese government going to deal with AI? The cover of my book, which portray a man walking on high wire, can already give you some prediction of what's happening, and the dynamic pyramid model is also helpful for us to think about the trajectory of China's future tech regulation. If you think about the perspective from the Chinese government, right? On the one hand, it cares deeply about economic growth, right? I mean, as an authoritarian government, one of the most important sources of legitimacy is economic prosperity. Okay, and AI expected to bring enormous commercial benefits to the Chinese society, and as China is a very big manufacturing country, they expect to reap enormous benefits from this technology. And the other big elephant in the room is that China is now competing intensively with the US to claim AI supremacy, right? A few years ago, China was almost on par with the US, and you heard Washington, D.C. sending out all this report alarming that, look, I mean, China might be ahead of us with AI, right? However, in the past few years, the US is now clearly ahead of China with ChatGPT, right? I mean, and the US has imposed several rounds of export restrictions of NVIDIA's most advanced AI chips to China. China is now lagging behind, right? So from the standpoint of the Chinese government, this is a battle they cannot afford to lose. And the last thing that they want is to have regulation to hold back the innovation. However, just like the man walking the high wire, the government is also struggling with competing interests. As an authoritarian government, it is inherently insecure about information control. And particularly with generative AI, because the AI output is so hard to predict and control, right? It is really extremely concerned that AI generative output will interfere with public discourse. So what does China decide to do? right? What you observe on the surface is that the Chinese government has been extremely proactive in churning out AI legislations to try to control this technology. In 2021, China was the first country to introduce comprehensive rules to regulate recommendation algorithm. And a year later, China also became the first country to introduce rules to regulate deepfake. And in 2023, 6 months after ChatGPT emerged, China had already introduced rules to regulate generative AI ahead of the EU. I know EU is very close to finalize the AI Act. Well, it's already finalizing. It's going to publish it very soon. But China's actually ahead of the EU in introducing very comprehensive rules to regulate GPT-like services. Okay, so on the surface, it looked like the Chinese government is very strict. It's going to, impose very tight censorship and control over AI content. But that is misreading the message here. We go back to what this man is trying to do. He's juggling and he's trying to manage competing interests here. What I particularly want to highlight in today's talk is that when you look at the Chinese law, okay, you actually should pay more attention to the expressive power of the law rather than the substance, the protective value of the law. Because our audience here may tend to see law as something that offering protective functions for our people, for its users, for the public, right? But in the Chinese case, particularly with the AI legislation, I saw the law actually offer very little protective value for the Chinese public. Instead, what the law mostly does is to send a very strong policy signal to the market, to the business communities, that the government is trying to enable this technology to grow this area of the economy, right? I mean, trying to send a very industry-friendly signal. And the other important function of the law is that they're trying to act as a focal point to gather all the industry participants together to coordinate their actions in order to forge ahead with AI development. So how does the government send a very strong policy signal through the law? Okay, when we look at the first draft of the law that was introduced in April last year, it was very strict. It contains some impossible provisions, like, you need to ensure your AI generative output is accurate and true, right? And this is impossible given the hallucination problem of, GPT. But in 3 months' time, when they finalized the law, they significantly diluted some of these provisions and removed some of the impossible provisions, and so make it much easier for firms to comply with. And by the way, they create a very large carve-out. So the law, the generative AI measures only applies to those that offer services to the public. So in other words, if you are Microsoft offering services for enterprise use, you're not even subject to the law. And that goes back to the beginning when I talk about why China wants to discipline the AI technology. It's precisely they're worried about this technology can interfere with public discourse. Now, when this technology is only offering for enterprise use, they couldn't care less, right? I mean, so they create this large carve-out so that allow the small and medium-sized companies to flourish with little regulatory oversight, right? And they also significantly dilute the law. And by the way, when the final law was introduced, it was jointly promulgated by 7 central ministries in China, and some of these ministries are in charge of empowering this technology, the so-called self-sufficiency initiative, to help China to compete with the US, right? So you see within this legislator, there are a clear faction of pro-growth faction and a pro-regulation faction. And the ultimate product, the finalized law, which is a compromise product, send us very strong signal that pro-growth faction have prevailed over the pro-regulation faction, right? Because victory conveys power. And this policy signal is extremely important. It's extremely important. It's more important than any other provision in the law because investors respond to policy. Just like what I said at the very beginning, why investors panic when they saw Alibaba was investigated? Because they saw this as a policy signal, right? policy is above the law in the Chinese context. And the other important function of the law is it explicitly incorporates a lot of the industrial policy language into law to try to coordinate everybody together to coordinate the regulators, coordinate the industry participants, and they're trying to coordinate important inputs into the AI model like data, computing power. They're trying to coordinate standard setting, and they're even trying to coordinate the local legislators. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to delve deeply into each of this segment. But suffice to say, what you see the Chinese government is doing is this so-called, we call it in Chinese, 举国 approach. Basically, it's a whole of society approach to trying to mobilize every corner of the Chinese society to forge ahead with AI development. And so the way that China is doing with AI is similar how it's trying to empower its, how it's trying to develop semiconductor, high manufacturing. I mean, just think about EVs, right? I mean, that's a similar approach the Chinese government has taken, trying to mobilize the whole society to develop EV, and they succeeded. And China now become the largest EV manufacturer in the world, and they're creating all sorts of problems for other countries, including Europe. And this is perfectly consistent with this kind of whole society approach. And okay, let me stop here. And I would love to welcome a feedback and questions from our audience, and also a discussion with Nancho. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for this. I think we all agree it was a fascinating presentation, especially with insights that, as you said, probably a lot of people in Spain and across Europe, when they first heard about the problems that Jack Ma was encountering with the state, they probably used or they referred to a framework in which they would place someone like probably Khodorkovsky in Russia, like the big businessman growing too powerful and then challenging the state, and then the state going back at him, right? But I think what you describe here helps a lot in placing in context, in putting in context what happened then there. Still, I would say that you may find surprising that Spain having a memory of being an authoritarian state. There are, of course, many things dealing with regulation that are familiar, and students of public policy, of course, and regulation would make the difference that in Spain under Franco, Spain was not a state under the rule of law, but it was a state of laws, right? There were laws, but this didn't necessarily mean that the country was governed by laws, but the laws were also instrumental for policy reasons, and this tension, I think, is very familiar, even if, of course, China is completely different, but I think a lot of people are familiar with this tension between technocrats and ideologists, and to which extent in a one-party or in a no-party state, all these processes of regulation can get very complicated. So this was just a comment to set the scene, in the sense that that at the end, even in Spain, you see, and we've been listening and exposed to a lot of discussion or listening a lot in terms of Asian values, right? But at the end, authoritarian regimes are very similar across the world, and they stand for, as you say, stability and cohesion. They worry a lot about succession, and they don't quite know how to deal with civil society because they have to keep vigilant. But sorry for this. This was just a comment in order to tell you that lots of the things that you say, even if different, they may resonate with experience in public policy that countries such as Spain and others who've been through authoritarian regimes have experienced. So, but then my first question would then be, as you said, China was very innovative. I remember reading the book by Kai-Fu Lee on AI superpowers. These creative forces in innovation were amazing. The US was very scared because China was getting everything right and innovating and doing a lot of things. I remember very recently still, the head of AI at the Pentagon resigned because he was saying that we've lost this race against China. So, and then you had this complete interruption of the process for the reasons you mentioned before, which have to do a lot with the financial markets and other things. But so the question is, and you mentioned that in part, like, can China now get its industry back in track when the game has become mostly geopolitical, and you have to do this with a tightened regulation, but also a geopolitical context which is very pressing, and in which you don't have access to chips, your technology is contested, your firms are also curtailed abroad, like Huawei and CTE. So, how is going to be China able to do this now when it has kind of tied both hands to its back, one at home and another internationally?
It is hard, right? I mean, I have to admit, it's hard to be a Chinese tech firm at home, that you are subject to stringent regulation. The government grows suspicious of your power and influence, and there's a lot of regulatory pressures. But on the other hand, when you're overseas, your Chinese identity will be holding you back, whether you are Huawei or you are TikTok or Shein or Temu, right? I mean, it's become a liability to become a Chinese firm. So that's why everybody wants to disguise themselves as somebody else. But do you still see the promise of the Chinese tech firms? I think so. Partly, first, China is a vast country. It's a huge country. It's a home to many, many talents in the country. And they still have a lot of money, despite, these tech firms losing a lot of market cap during the crackdown. But nonetheless, these are still remain the largest tech companies in the world. Okay, so still deep-pocketed and great talents, and the government, most importantly, you have to say, despite their heavy-handed intervention, which tend to generate a lot of unintended consequences that you don't want, right? However, they can do good things. I mean, because in many ways, the Chinese government are giving helping hands to these tech firms for them to prosper and grow. And that's precisely how you see China can really build the whole supply chain in EV in just a few years. A few years ago, when the Chinese government, the Shanghai government, welcomed Elon Musk to build a factory in Shanghai, everybody was scratching their head. Why on earth do you embrace Elon Musk and then embrace Tesla to create a factory in the country, right? And that strategy works, right? I mean, when you it's almost like you invite a fox in the hen's house, and it stimulates competition among the Chinese EV manufacturers. You create more competition, and having a very fierce competitor on the ground helps to revitalize that sector. And then the Chinese government play a very important role building up all the charging stations all over the country. It proliferates all over the country. This is something you don't see, whether in Europe or even in California, right, where the EV took off, right, initially. You don't have that many charging stations, but Chinese government built this charging station. The Chinese government was an investor, was a promoter, was as a supplier, was a customer in the whole supply chain. And that's why they can prop things up so quickly, right? I mean, so in a way, I pointed out a lot of the weakness in the Chinese system, but there are also strengths that we have to recognize. Yeah.
Well, it's good you mentioned Elon Musk, because as you know, he's not very popular in Europe these days. And also because he comes across as very as showing deep double standards. Like,
yes,
in the US he's a libertarian.
Yeah.
In Europe as well, but then in China he signs up a joint letter with EV producers saying that he's very much in favor of an harmonious competition, and so on. And as you say, I think the framework that you explain here helps a lot to understand that, as you mentioned also this morning, that Chinese firms or foreign firms operating in China, when they get a fine by a competition authority, they thank the competition authority for having let them know that they were doing something wrong, and so on, which is a very anomalous behavior in an economy, because you always try to push back and try to get back to court and don't pay that, right? So Elon Musk is a very good example of how to adapt to these regulatory conditions, right?
He know how to play the game in another foreign country, and obviously he won a lot in the Chinese market, right? I mean, very recently, the Chinese government rolled out the red carpet for him when he visited Beijing, and then immediately you saw there was news that the government is now relaxing restrictions on Tesla's car, because it used to be a lot of restriction on Tesla's car on government premises, state-owned firm premises, because they're concerned about data security issues. Now, when Elon Musk was willing to come to Beijing and then make it, appear in the public stage, right, seemingly to support of Chinese economy, and then Chinese government trying to entice him back with very good, carrot, right? I mean, so he know how to play the game, but after all, he know that in China, who is the real boss, right? I mean, unlike here, right?
Yeah, we wish we knew who was the real boss in Europe, right? But then I wanted to ask you on AI regulation, because as you said, some of us around here were also around with Anu Bradford came and explained also her framework about digital empires, that if Europe's approach is mostly based on rights, the US approach is mostly based on safety. That's kind of the minimum threshold. What is then like the Chinese approach? Because of course it's not necessarily or very evidently on rights. AI can also be a very powerful instrument of surveillance and control. And as you said also on data protection, while China is very wary of firms exporting data out of China, but of course it's collecting data also from abroad to feed its system. So what is the motivation behind AI regulation in China if it's not rights? Is it just safety or control? How would you describe that?
Right, the single most important priority for the Chinese government with AI legislation is content control, information control, because as an authoritarian government, it is inherently insecure about information control. It's worried AI might interfere with public discourse. And that's why you always see the Chinese government always playing the pioneering role in rolling out all this AI legislation. But what about every other aspect of AI governance, like issues like data security issues, IP infringement, bias, and AI safety, all the other areas all play a secondary role in the Chinese, in the calculation of the Chinese regulators, because they want to prop up the industry. They want to enable the industry. They want to, create a very industry-friendly environment for this AI firms to flourish and grow in China, right? I mean, so yes, their bottom line is information control. They want to make sure that the AI output is political aligned with the socialist value, but everything else is secondary. Right, I mean, so the individual rights are sacrificed for the sake of industrial growth and for the bigger society pursuit to become an AI superpower.
So you would, does that mean that you would then have a kind of a decoupling in which you have uses of AI, which are of course economically very productive because you maximize returns in industry and so on, but then you have a whole other size of AI industry that is completely different. My question here is, to which extent this information control need by the regime affects the performance of AI when it comes to language models? That is, if maybe our students, sit in front of the computer and ask ChatGPT, can you tell me a bit more about, about French Revolution and how that compares with today, or, what is the difference between an authoritarian regime and democracy? As a user, when you use a language model in China, I guess this is totally impaired because the system is not going to return, or is going to return an answer that makes sense maybe in a local context. But how do you deal with this need that you cannot feed probably the Chinese ChatGPT with the archive of the New York Times, just like that, right?
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. We have to admit that the fact that the Chinese government need to maintain very strict content moderation definitely undermine the performance of these public AI services. That's for sure. Right? I mean, so for a user interacting with the Chinese version of the GPT-like services, their experience will not be as fun as you would use GPT, but you can't really access GPT in China unless you use VPN, which everybody does. So this is something that, the Chinese government is consciously aware that they are giving up in order to exercise control. However, for AI application and use, they're catered for enterprise use. And with the development of the general AI model, I mean, it has very wide industry application, not just for chatbots, right? I mean, it could apply for the autonomous driving. It can apply to all sorts of industry settings, right? So for that, there is less of a hamperment, like a concern that you pointed out.
Yeah, and then but I wanted to check with you at least one thing which we hear or we receive from China, which is a bit more positive in the uses in the regulation of technology, is when it comes to child protection, right? That this is something in which across Europe is very worrying. You mentioned a bit about deepfakes, but I wanted you to go a bit more into that, because we have had very recently in Spain, in other EU countries, very negative experiences, because all of a sudden people discover that these kind of existential risks, maybe you don't, maybe they are exaggerated or not, but people thought that this technology was in the hands of big tech companies and therefore you could go after them. But all of a sudden you have like 5 guys in a remote village doing deep fake porns of their schoolmates. And then people become like really shocked because they didn't know that the technology was so available and so easy to use and misuse at a very basic user level, right? And then the issue of child protection and these kind of things has become very popular. But I understand that in China this is also something, as you mentioned, that is being heavily regulated, also limiting the access to technology by children, right?
Well, I mean, yes, during the crackdown, the Chinese government did want to push the firms to impose more restriction for teenager access to video games, to a lot of the apps, right? I mean, it worked temporarily, but it didn't work for a long time. I mean, as we talk about, this crackdown only lasted for 18 months. It's short-lived, right? I mean, now things are back to normal again, and regulation has been relaxed, right? I mean, so I wouldn't count on Chinese regulation to really exercise effective oversight over the big tech companies. And to be honest, I mean, the problem in China is way more severe than what you encounter in the West, because China is home to a very large underground economy that specializes in producing fakes, counterfeit products like fake reviews, and including deep fakes, right? I mean, now there's a lot of financial scandals in China where people use deep fake technology to defraud, their colleagues, their friends, and their relatives, right? I mean, so this is becoming a very serious problem, not just in Europe, but also in China, right? I mean, there's a lot of prosecution going on in China of these kind of fraudulent events, but China is a huge country, right? I mean, so, and it's not, having some prosecutions, it's not sufficient to stop this kind of scandals and fraudulent behavior. Yeah, unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah. So my last question, and then I open to you. One of the things that I remember Kai-Fu Lee and other scholars have highlighted about China's tech sector that is different from the US is that in China you had a vertical integration of tech companies, no? That the guys delivering food, yes, they would need to develop a payment system, yeah, integrated with facial recognition, yeah, and then an e-card in order to do that. Whereas in the US, the Apple and the Googles would just keep kind of the cream of the cake, but in China you had to go all the way down to integrate vertically. Does this still is this still the case, and does this present problems of regulation and competition that are in that case then different of what we need to deal with at this as they said, because we don't have anything that like Deliveroo developing an AI facial recognition system with their own credit card and so on. So you never leave the platform from the moment you pay, you order food to would you pay, and then you get a credit at home and so on.
Right, and it actually partly reflects the concentration issue, how the severity of the concentration problem in the Chinese economy. Now, China basically have a duopoly. We basically have two major big tech companies. One is called Alibaba, the other is called Tencent. They own hundreds of portfolio companies. So basically, this is exactly what you described, right? When I wake up in the morning, I can just go with one of these duopoly, and then I can do everything with their apps. They are all interconnected within their own ecosystem. So we have two separate ecosystems, Alibaba ecosystem and Tencent ecosystem. And you within each ecosystem, you can pay, you can order food, you can listen to music, you can watch movie, you can deal with everything within this ecosystem. Each of them also have their own payment app, their little financial scheme, right? I mean, and so that is closely integrated, and that's precisely the reason why the Chinese government wake up. I was like, oh my God, this thing has got out of control. They have so much influence in the economy, and our tech sector, actually have way more antitrust issues than you see in the West. Yeah.
Okay, so. Let's open it to the floor. Who wants to put up a question? Over there, I think there is a mic for you. Please just say your name.
Hi, my name is Angel. Thank you for your presentation. You said before that one of the main advantages of China is its talent pool. In the last few years, we have heard a lot about top Chinese American scientists leaving American universities for China, and we have also heard about less Chinese talented students going to the States than years before. Do you think this is a relevant trend? And can it have an impact on the development of the competition between the two big players? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm definitely partly, this kind of inflow of top Chinese American scientists is partly thanks to the U.S. aggressive China Initiative program that the Department of Justice initiated that specifically target on a lot of the Chinese, American Chinese scientists working at top U.S. academic institutions, right? And then they have brought several very high-profile cases against scientists working at Harvard and working at Texas University that created chilling effects among Chinese scientists working in the U.S., and as a result, they are all choosing to come back to work for China. So I in my home institution, University of Hong Kong, the president of my university was a Berkeley professor, a top scientist from Berkeley. He brought back 4 other Berkeley scientists now working at important positions, either as dean or vice president of the university. Okay, so just in my university alone, at the leadership level, it's dominated by these overseas returnees from the U.S. schools, and not to say many other top universities in the mainland China. You have similarly seen this kind of phenomenon thanks to the U.S. aggressive strategy, which is really stupid, right? Because these are the best scientific talents that you have, and not just that, they are now imposing a lot of the restrictions for Chinese students to study in the U.S. And even for those that are already studying in the U.S., even when they come back to U.S., they face interrogations, harassment at the customs, and some of them were even sent back and have their visa revoked by the border agencies for, basically no reason. Right? I mean, that definitely will have a chilling impact on the willingness of the Chinese students, young talents to move and study in the U.S., and that will benefit Chinese scientific development in the longer term. Yeah.
More questions? José, please.
Thank you. I'm José María Areilza. I wanted to ask you about another very important sector of the Chinese economy, the real estate sector, which accounts for 30% of the Chinese economy. I really like your theory of regulation, but is this general theory applicable also to understand what has been going on in the real estate sector, which is, as you very well know, so important to sustain growth, which is also essential for the legitimacy of the Chinese political system?
Look, I mean, all the previous Chinese leadership all know that there is a big over-leverage problem in the real estate sector. Okay, and years after year, they try all sorts of methods to try to deflate this bubble and to no avail, because this is such an important sector that accounts to 30% of China's GDP. Whenever they try to do something, they're worried about the collapse of the economy. Then, because a lot of the Chinese household invest very heavily. They don't invest heavily in the stock market. They invest very heavily in the house, right? Because this is deemed a very safe investment. And if you're going to do something to the house prices, then it will bring down the whole, bring down their confidence in the Chinese economy. It will affect consumption, so create all sorts of problems in the Chinese economy, which is exactly what China is experiencing today, right? And so when Xi Jinping started to impose this very stringent 3 red lines on Chinese property firms in 2020, it generate a huge panic among Chinese property firms, because never had it before did they take very serious intervention into this sector. And it seems like this time they really mean business. They are really going to be very tough. And then we saw, Evergrande, which is China's largest property developer, collapse overnight. And then ever since then, it kind of like a domino effects. You see one after another, they collapse and they go bankrupt. And now, at the point that the Chinese economy is at the rock bottom, the Chinese government know that they have to deflate this bubble, but they can't really afford it anymore. So now deflating a bubble create a bigger bubble in the economy, because now directly contribute to the slowdown economy, contribute to huge youth unemployment, right? And it's a point the Chinese government is now unfortunately walking back from its property reform. Now the government is offering to buy those unsold properties from the developers, right? Because they can't afford to let the property prices to deflate, because that will generate even more panic among the Chinese consumers. But what happened to those that are unsold? The government is coming in to buy it, and then again, it's not solving the problem. You create a soft budget constraint problem with the Chinese property firms, right? What the government should have done is that they should have intervened way earlier, before the bubble become a huge bubble, right? I mean, back in 2016, already there was a lot of people making, whistleblowing complaints to Chinese regulatory authorities. Like, look, I mean, there's a problem with the over-leverage problem with all these property developers. Nobody listened. Nobody do anything. And then these problems continue to grow and until it becomes completely out of control, right? And now when you ask around the policy circle, do you have any remedy to tackle this? Nobody knows. And I don't know whether they will ever, we can only offer temporary relief, right? I mean, like what the government is doing is actually, making things even worse in the future. But it's not tackling the fundamental problem. Because at this point, the problem has become so severe. It's not a solvable problem anymore, right? Yeah.
yeah, you may want to spend a bit more time in Spain looking at our real estate bubble. You will find lots of similarities and the lost decade we suffered, because we burst, or the bubble was burst. So, but of course, it's a very familiar experience as well. Are there more questions around? So while you warm up, I wanted also to ask you on TikTok. Governments across the European Union, the EU institutions, they banned official phones from using it. There is, of course, in the US, we've seen a very similar movement. What do you make of that? Some people say that this is just because this is just a foreign company that is Chinese and is too powerful, and therefore, they just want to curtail its power and so on. Some other people say that there are legitimate concerns in terms of the massive data flows that are going back to China and then stored, and fears that can be used to profile individuals or being used later against them and so on. So what do you make of that? Is TikTok such an innocent cat lovers tool, or is it something hidden behind that we should worry about in the way they treat data and data protection issues?
Right. I mean, do you think that Europeans and Americans have legitimate concern about TikTok? I mean, there are two major issues with TikTok. First is that how TikTok treats the data, whether it will send the data back to China. And I think that problem is easier to address in the sense that if we insist upon data localization, having the data stored in your home jurisdiction, that mostly should be fine. The more difficult question is the manipulation of the algorithm by the Chinese parent company, and that is something that TikTok trying to address through this so-called Project Taxes that it has. Oracle is actually pay Oracle hundreds of millions of dollars to have Oracle monitor how TikTok deal with algorithm, right? So there's no other social media platform in the US that is subject to way more stringent regulation than TikTok. Right, Facebook doesn't have somebody monitoring how it manipulates algorithm, right? Instagram doesn't have, right? But TikTok has, right? I mean, I would say that in that sense, that I actually think that it's actually very costly for the Chinese government to interfere with the algorithm because it's subject to almost like very close surveillance by Oracle. A pay service actually by TikTok. What I am more worried about TikTok, however, is its recommendation algorithm that make our teenagers and actually us, adults as well, extremely addicted to this service. I don't know how many of you have used TikTok. I will be extremely worried about my children using TikTok because the Chinese engineers have really perfected the recommendation algorithm to kind of like a perfection level, because they incorporate a lot of psychology into the design process of the product, and that's why TikTok was so viral and did way better than Facebook or other US tech firms, because their recommendation algorithm is so addictive. I think this is a bigger problem that the Western society needs to tackle rather than the data security problem, because the addiction is a very huge problem for our kids, our teenagers, right? And unfortunately, despite the fact that Europe has very strict data privacy protection, I don't think it's doing enough to address this problem.
Yeah. With algorithmic transparency requirements and so on, but as you say, I think TikTok upgrades or updates its algorithm every few minutes for every individual issue. So it's a very successful company from a technological point of view. They've mastered, as you say, this to an extent that no one else. So the experience for the user is amazing, right? Well,
I have to say, this is not a country this is not a company I have great respect for, because the way it makes business is to make people get addicted to certain type of content, and more often than not, those viral content are harmful content, right? If it's not good for the development of our children, it's not good for us in general, But unfortunately, once you get used to this phone, you can't put it down, despite knowing that this is not good for you. And so I don't have too much respect for businesses that thrive on people's addiction. Right, I mean, and when you saw the CEO of the CEO of TikTok, testifying in front of the U.S. Congress and touting, the benefits of TikTok. I mean, he didn't relate to the audience that he didn't allow his daughters to use TikTok. Right, I mean, he knows this thing is harmful for children, and I strongly urge European regulator to do something about this. I mean, this is a much bigger issue. It is in fact a real issue than the national security issue everybody was talking about. Yeah.
Great. Any more questions, María?
Gilbert Mathieu. In the last years, we saw the Chinese government crack down on Hong Kong society. It was accustomed to freedom, to openness. So how do the people feel now? And do you see an impact on talent? People, what is the temperature of the society there?
Well, I visited Berlin just a couple of days ago, and I obviously, like a lot of other tourists, I visited the Berlin Wall. And when I saw the Berlin Wall and the story behind it, I saw, people voted with their feet, risking their life by trying to get to the other side of the wall. Okay? Now in Hong Kong, when the government clamped down on this democratic movement, people can't vote, but they vote with their feet. So you saw a large outflow of the Chinese Hong Kong population in the past few years. And this is unprecedented, that we see more outflow than inflow of population. Chinese population is declining in the past few years because a lot of Chinese Hong Kong people decide to leave their homes, territory, and move to overseas, right? I mean, and that tells a lot about the sentiments on the ground. But at the same time, the Chinese government is trying to fill in the void by lowering the immigration requirement from the mainland to Hong Kong. So then you start to see more mainland population and now integrating with the Hong Kong community. Okay, so this has become a new dynamic. Hong Kong will become more and more like another Chinese mainland city. And is that something we want, right? I mean, unfortunately, this is the reality, but if I wish for, I hope that Hong Kong can continue to play this unique role of bridging the West and the East, and preserving its autonomy, and in dealing in trying to attract more talents, right? I mean, having the freedom of speech and having the freedom to do business, right? I mean, I hope Hong Kong can continue to play that role, and I hope the government can, continue to give Hong Kong the space to grow and flourish, and particularly to uphold the rule of law system in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong has a very different legal system than the rest of the mainland China, and I hope the government will continue to give it that autonomy, because this is truly vital to the future success of Hong Kong.
Right. Yeah. More questions? Then maybe another thing that I had in my list was, people hear a lot about social scoring in China, but then they may not necessarily know how it works. There is a system of lists in Spain, but they're kept in silos. Like, you may not be allowed to enter into a casino or a gambling house, or you may be in a list for banks, because you've defaulted on a mortgage. But this information is kept in silos and is not publicly known. Is that the case? So how does the social scoring system in China work? Do you have access, and is this public? Can anyone check on anyone, or this is something just the government authorities at given moments can do?
I think there's a big misconception about China's social scoring system, that thinking that it's worked really well, and then the authority to know everything about you, and then can monitor and survey you and keep this credit score. The reality is that only in a couple of extreme examples has the government been able to exercise have been able to conduct this kind of social scoring system. And in reality, there is very little control of what's been going on, right? I mean, this is a country with 1.3 billion people, right? And home to 31 provincial provinces, hundreds of thousands of cities, right? I mean, when we are talking about 2 or 3 cities that are able to implement the so-called social scoring system, that's hardly representative of the whole country. And the reality is this thing it's not workable in the vast majority of the scenarios. However, there are a couple of examples where in some villages and a couple of cities where they were able to keep the profiling of people's, keep quite detailed profile of people's behavior and actions, right? I mean, that becomes sensationalized, and people thought, oh, Chinese government was able to track everything and did everything, and which is not true, right? The other thing I want to say about the social scoring system is that to the extent those systems were implemented in those cities, actually the vast majority of people like it. The reason is because there's very low level of trust in the Chinese society. There's no credit card, and very few credit card was used. Chinese people actually prefer to have, in a way, this kind of loyalty or honesty regime, so that keep in check those people who misbehave, right? And the reason is, say, even if you prevail in the lawsuit against somebody, and you're trying to get your money back, I mean, this person have fly away. I mean, there's nothing you can do about it. But now, if we have the social credit system, this person might, have difficulty getting on the train, because now the China's high-speed train system, you need to use your ID card to access. He might not be able to take an airplane. He might not be able to fly, right? I mean, they cannot take a train. It's also a problem for him in the society. And the Chinese people think, oh, this is actually working, because this social scoring system is actually deterring dishonest behavior in the Chinese society. So in the Chinese unique institutional context, this system may work in some scenarios, and in fact gain quite popular support based on what we observed in those cities that were implemented. Oddly enough, I know that this is something is prohibited outright in the EU, right?
Yeah, because as you say, issues of trust are very problematic in some context and so on. Okay?
Right.
So I think if there are no more questions, I think we can join in thanking you for your work, in encouraging you to keep it. This is a key. I mean, the issues you deal with are key, and they touch on preoccupations that are very central for contemporary society. So we can only benefit from having people like you writing and discussing these issues, and coming all the way down to Madrid to be with us today. It was a pleasure, and we thank you very much for this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. Yeah.